Chapters 11 and 12 narrate the increasing tensions between Jesus and his contemporaries. Obviously, there are tensions between Jesus and the religious authorities. But there are also tensions between Jesus and the crowds. And even between Jesus and John the Baptist. Now, chapter 13 describes a series of parables that Jesus tells about the kingdom of heaven. Now, those two sections may not seem to be related to each other, but they are. And in fact, our paragraph this morning, where we see that there is even emerging tension between Jesus and his own family, helps us to build that bridge. For in that paragraph, we see Jesus living out the primacy of the kingdom even before he articulates it in chapter 13. And at the same time, we see Jesus offering hope and direction that has guided his people for generations. Now, you might be reading this paragraph and kind of going, where did you get all that from this? And in fact, you might even be reading this paragraph and kind of going, why is this here? Jesus is just sitting around talking to some people. His family shows up. What's the big deal? Well, let's begin by understanding the context in which this event happens. Because if we don't understand that context, we won't understand Jesus' response to his family. So let's just kind of set the scene. Jesus is somewhere in a house, and there's a group of people around him, and he's teaching. And his mother and brothers show up. They're outside, and they want him to come outside. Matthew and Mark as well say, so that they can speak to him. Right? Luke just simply says, so that they can see him. And that's when Jesus is told about it, that's when Jesus gives this peculiar response. You are my mother and brothers. It feels a little dismissive. It feels a little disrespectful. But again, we need to recall the circumstances in which this family visit take place. For the last 2 chapters, and even before that, we've been seeing this ongoing tension between Jesus and the religious authorities. Now, that's not just a problem for Jesus. Because of the way that this society works, it's a problem for his family as well. We'll talk about this more in a moment, but Galilee was permeated with a series of informal networks. It's how people got things done. And when you did something, you weren't just doing it as sort of an isolated individual. If I, I don't know, started juggling chainsaws in front of, police headquarters out here, nobody knows any of my family in this town. They would just look at me and go, what's that crazy guy doing? But if I were to do that in my hometown of Redfield, Arkansas, people would all of a sudden start talking to my parents or my cousins or my aunts or uncles and be like, did you see what Wade was doing out there in front of City Hall? Did you know he could juggle chainsaws? That's the difference we're talking about here, okay? People are coming to Jesus' family and saying, hey, you might want to know Jesus got in another scrap with the Pharisees last night. And in fact, some of the Pharisees might have even been coming to family members themselves and saying, hey, you need to do something about this Jesus. But of course, this emerging hostility is a problem for Jesus and his disciples. The Pharisees don't, especially those that are in Galilee, they don't have any power to really do anything to Jesus. But as the saying goes, they know people who know people. Back to those informal networks again. They have influence. They have the ability to get things done. Now, that tension that sort of puts a spotlight on Jesus and on his family happens in a very specific historical context. That is, the imprisonment of John the Baptist. There's already one prophet in Herod's prison. There's no reason there can't be two. Right? Plus, John's gospel shares with us an interesting little fact. Jesus' brothers didn't yet believe. They weren't buying all this Messiah stuff. They weren't buying all this kingdom of God stuff. Now, John doesn't say that Mary didn't believe, but the brothers didn't. And the brothers are the real muscle here. So, you've got this family that's experiencing some degree of social discomfort, some degree of social hostility. And they've got plenty of motivation to say, we need to do something about this, and no real motivation to stand up for Jesus. So what do? Well, truthfully, they are there to get him. They are there to take him home. They are there to, you might say, arrest him. That's what they are there for. But here's what Jesus knows. If he goes with them, that's the end of his public ministry. He will have been humiliated in the eyes of the public. And you might say, well, he could kind of massage it by telling the people who are there, hey, I've got an emergency at home, I gotta go take care of it. No. People in the ancient world are just like people in our day. They like to gossip. And this would have gotten out, especially since Jesus' brothers are really doing this to take the heat off of themselves. So what are they going to do? They're going to blab the first chance they get. Oh yeah, we went and we got that Jesus. We got him locked up at home and mom's sitting guard over him, not letting him go anywhere. That's the end of his public ministry, especially in a culture that values honor and shame. Jesus knows this. So how's he going to respond? Well, it's interesting. Jesus doesn't just call out his family and sort of humiliate them. It feels that way because of kind of the way that he puts it. But we'll get to that in a moment. No, what Jesus does is he uses this as a teaching opportunity. Now, there are two aspects of Jesus' message that we want to look at, okay? Now, the first aspect is rather straightforward. Jesus is living out what he has demanded of his disciples. He's practicing what he preached. Notice what I've put here on the screen for you. I've put Matthew chapter 10, verses 37 through 39. And what did Jesus say to his disciples? You're not worthy of me if you don't love me more than your closest familial relationships. Well, Jesus is doing that very thing when it comes to his own mission and his obedience to God. And he's doing it explicitly. So Jesus is living out the very thing that he demands of his own disciples. We'll talk a little bit more why that is in just a minute. But in order to do that, we need to come to the second aspect of Jesus' message. And this is the one we really want to focus on. Because Jesus, like he so often does, Jesus will not allow this teaching opportunity to pass him by. And what does he do? He asks this rhetorical question, who are my mother and my brothers? And then he kind of waves his hand around. He doesn't just sort of point, he waves his hand around and says, these are my mother and brothers. Anyone who does the will of my Father is my brother and sister and mother. Jesus uses this opportunity to redefine family, or as social scientists would say it, to redefine kinship. And it is a radical thing that he is doing here. Now let's explain why that's so radical, and then let's explain what Jesus is actually doing here. Okay? So what is Jesus, why is this so radical? Well, it's because of how this culture works. For one thing, it's because of how this culture works. I said to you a few minutes ago that this is a culture, this is a society permeated by informal networks. Well, let me ask you something. In a society like that, how do you get anything done? How do you find a job? How do you find somebody to repair your roof? How do you find a spouse for your son or daughter? Well, you don't put an ad in the paper. You don't go slap your resume down on somebody's desk. This is not a meritocracy. You don't even, send your son or daughter to the synagogue and say, go find a girl you like or go find a boy you like. That's not what you do. No, you work through these informal networks. And the most important of those networks is family. Family defined either narrowly or broadly. That's why we call it kinship. It's this sense that we belong to the same people, right? Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, that all sounds good in an Old Testament context where people, where the land was divided up by clans and then by families, but what about in the New Testament where you have all this urbanization and you've had all this colonization by Greeks and Romans? That's a good question. But what urbanization and colonization did was it served to actually intensify these desires to work within kinship groups. Think about it this way. You live in a cosmopolitan city. Maybe the city's only about 2,000 people, like Ranger, or maybe it's, more like 50, 60, 70, 80,000 people. But either way, regardless of the size of the city, it is a cosmopolitan city, meaning there's people from all over the world in that city. And this is, nearly 2,000 years before Martin Luther King Jr. or Mahatma Gandhi. Most of those people are hostile to people who aren't like them. Okay? Well, what are you going to do to make sure that you're not taken advantage of, to make sure that your sons and daughters marry people who share your values? What are you going to do just to protect yourself on a daily basis? You're going to cluster with people who share your group identity, namely your ethnicity, if you can get it, your tribal affiliation, your family. I mean, look, this is how this works. If I'm out, kind of looking around at the different, stalls in a marketplace, and I'm like, man, I really need a carpenter. And I happen to run across, say, Roy. And Roy's trying to get some business and blah, blah, blah. And he and I start talking. And all of a sudden we discover that we have a third cousin in common. Well, now I feel more confident in hiring Roy to do the work because he has an obligation to me, an obligation of chesed, faithfulness, because we are kin. And Roy can be more confident in doing the work for me because I have an obligation to pay him on time. Same obligation, chesed. We belong to the same people. Okay? Now, I didn't put this on your outline here, but there's a third reason why family is so important to how this culture works and why Jesus' words are so radical. And it's simply the importance of family in the Old Testament. The whole Jewish nation, and it's not just its political identity, but its religious identity, is shaped by familial kinship. Now, never mind that there had been enough intermarrying that there probably wasn't much or any genetic differences between people who identified in one tribe or another. There just had been too much intermarriage. But the tribes, the family units, these traced out genealogies mattered to these folks. They would have loved Nelda's work and paid good money for it. They would have loved Ancestry DNA or whatever DNA company you like to use. They would have loved this. Why? Because so much of your identity theologically was wrapped up in who you are. But what does Jesus do? Jesus establishes an entirely new set of criteria for family. A new structure. That structure begins with God. There is only one Father, and it is God. And He is the centerpiece of this family. He is the one around whom this family revolves. Now, people in this family share bonds of mutual care, mutual relationship with one another. Okay? And there's even bonds of mutual responsibility. Notice what Jesus does there at the end of verse 50. Whoever does the will of my Father is, or the will of God, is my brother, my sister, my mother. Mother is a title of responsibility. Because you see, Jews are not Romans. For Romans, the pater familia, the father of the family, he's the one you have to obey. He's the one you have to satisfy. That's not what the law says. What do the 10 Commandments say? Obey, or I should say honor might as well say obey, but honor your father and your mother. For then you will live long in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. Right? Now, so there are these bonds of responsibility. And Jesus can put himself even in that kind of family. Why? Because the thing that holds the family together, the thing that defines whether the family is functioning the way that it should function, is obedience to the will of God. Right? Because what Jesus is really saying is, you have more in common with a stranger who's committed to the will of God than you do with your own brother who's a scoundrel. He's even saying, you could say, you could argue, he's at least implying that he himself can submit to a mother in the kingdom of God. Why? Because that mother is always going to be committed to doing the will of God. That mother is never going to get in the way of Jesus fulfilling his mission. The will of God becomes the thing that binds us together, but also the criterion, I should say, by which familial bonds are evaluated. Now, we need to take that seriously, and the way that we can take it seriously is by comparing a couple of different models for how we order our lives. That's what Jesus is talking about here. He is talking about how he himself is ordering his life. Now, some of you, many of you probably, were taught this first model of how we order our lives, the hierarchical model. Now, being Americans, we love a good hierarchy, right? We love clear lines. We love clear orders of importance. And so, for American civil religion, and by that I mean the way that religion and sort of American identity flow together to form a cohesive society, the way that American civil religion said you ought to order things is God is first. Well, at least they get that part right. Family second, then church, then nation, then other priorities, And a lot of you were probably taught that in church from the pulpit. But there are a couple of problems with that way of constructing our lives. Maybe even 3. Certainly 2. One of them is, can you really separate God and church? Now, I know what people are trying to say. What they're trying to say is, just because a committee at your church or your pastor or your deacon says you need to do X, Y, or Z, that is not the same as the will of God. And that is true. Correct? Okay? Please, if I tell you to jump off a bridge, don't do it. Okay? I am not the voice of God in that circumstance. But if Christ is truly the head of the church, and if the church is truly his body, it's not so easy, to separate, to just kind of neatly bifurcate God from church. So that's one problem. But another problem, a problem I think is much more serious, much more important, is that life is just messier than neat little hierarchies. Let me illustrate it this way. When I was in college, my first year, I lived with a close friend of mine from high school. He and I were roommates. And we were up talking one night, And he drew very, very clear boundaries, especially when it came to his family. His family was first over everything. He just said, look, man, if you're in the hospital and my brother's in the hospital at the same time, don't plan on seeing me. You ain't going to see me. And I understood what he was trying to say, but at the same time, it just didn't sit right with me. And finally I said, look, dude, if your brother's in the hospital with a hangnail and I'm in the hospital with a heart attack, you better get your sorry carcass up to my room. Your brother's going to be fine. I may not. Do you see what I was getting at? Life is more complicated than simply drawing boundaries and saying, well, this is more important than this. There are more factors at play than you can put into a simple sort of hierarchical process. And we do this all the time. We know this is true. Every time a firefighter goes running into a building, risking his own life in order to save a stranger, we don't think, well, wow, he really betrayed his priorities. He's got a wife and kids at home who need him, and he shouldn't have done. No. We celebrate his courage and his heroism, and heaven forbid, if the worst should happen, we rally around his family. Right? So what I want to propose for you is a different model. A different model. One that I think is much more Christian. One where God is at the center. And everything else in our lives is connected to and permeated by our loyalty to God, our commitment to Him. And so what helps us understand which thing we ought to do and which thing we ought to not do in a particular situation? It isn't some sort of artificial list of priorities. It's our commitment to God. It's our commitment to do His will. It's our commitment to do all the things that Jesus taught us. To love our neighbor. To love our enemy. To do to others what we would hope they would do to us. And a whole bunch of others besides, right? Now, in conclusion, if we hear Jesus saying what I really believe He is saying to the 21st century church, it will be a challenge to those of us who just want Jesus to perpetuate, to affirm, to bless the priorities that we already have. Now, as we'll learn later in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is not going to let you use Him to shirk your responsibilities. If you have parents, you're responsible for them. If you have children, you're responsible for them. If you have a spouse, you're responsible for him or her. But Jesus will also not allow us to use our priorities, whether they be our relationships, our family, our political ideology, our nation, our ethnicity. He will not allow us to use those priorities as idols. Because as soon as they become idols, they corrupt us. They lead us into sin. They destroy us. And if you think about it for just a little bit, and I invite you to do that, you'll figure it out. You'll see it. You'll start counting up instances on both hands and both feet that of times in your life where you have seen people, maybe even yourself, prioritize other things so much so that they became idols. And death and destruction were the result. Maybe not literal death, but certainly metaphorical death. But the message of Jesus is good news for those who do not have a family or a nation or a political party or some other identity group to call their own. There are lots of lonely people out there. There are lots of hurting people. There are lots of suffering people. And Jesus doesn't just offer them Himself. He certainly does that, but He doesn't just offer them Himself. He offers them us. He offers them a network of caring, supportive relationships. The message of Jesus is also good news for people who want more for their family, for their nation, for their community, for their church. Dare I say it? For their political party. Now, it's going to be hard. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but when the will of God begins to permeate every area of our lives, renovation, transformation happens. And when God is at work, He clarifies values, He clarifies priorities, and He enables human flourishing. Things change, things improve. Now, let's not make promises that Jesus doesn't make. We can't promise that if you really pursue the will of God, that it'll save your marriage. In fact, it might blow a hole in it. We can't promise that pursuing the will of God will lead to influence in your political party. These days, I can almost guarantee you it won't. And it doesn't matter what your party is. Democrat, Republican, Green, Libertarian, it doesn't matter. We can't promise that following the will of Jesus will produce the results in this world that you hope for. But what we can promise is that when God's will permeates every aspect of our lives, then in one sense or another, life happens. We find ourselves in the center of God's will. We find ourselves deeply and irrevocably, easy for me to say, connected to God's heart. We find ourselves on the front lines of God's kingdom. And while there may be wreckage and carnage in other places, there is goodness there. We serve a good God who wants to do good things. And even when the enemy comes at us with disaster after disaster after disaster, we can still trust in that goodness. And we can still walk with Him.